Okay, good deal. All right, so let me pull this up. So again, I'm not going to test on this chapter. We started it last semester and just we run out of time, but I still felt that there were some things I needed to at least kind of like basically expose you guys to, make you aware of. And so yesterday we were talking about, we're finishing up that section on kind of the various kind of regions and the people that made up the Roman Empire, right? And so there's this idea I was kind of talking about the concept of Romanization. And after the Romans would colonize a place, usually right through kind of military conquest, you'd have places like Spain, Iberia, and Gaul, Greece, and Asia Minor that would kind of Romanize within a few generations or so. All right, North Africa was kind of like that. What I talked about yesterday. Kind of the Roman kind of extent of North Africa stretched from basically Morocco, is now modern day Morocco, all the way through to Egypt. All right. So the western half, about Tunisia to Morocco, was brought into the Roman sphere of influence after the Punic Wars during the time of the Roman Republic, with the exception of places like Mauritania, a little bit further kind of in the southwest, kind of like a little bit further south of North Africa, and Numidia, places like that. And then Egypt was brought into the Roman sphere of influence after the conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony, right? And Egypt particularly was very important to the Romans. That was kind of like the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Most of the grain that was coming from into the main port of Rome of Ostia came from Egypt, if you will. So you'll find, like still today in North Africa, you'll find Roman ruins along coastline areas in places like Libya, Algeria, Tunisia. Egypt, you see a mix of obviously Egyptian kind of culture, Greek culture and Roman stuff there. All right. However, there was another place that was kind of like Britannia, where the Romans kind of had to have a constant military presence, mainly from revolts, and that's Judea, which is essentially Israel-Palestine right today. And that Roman presence was there to put down revolts that were generally kind of tied in with religion. Obviously, within Judea, Judaism was the main religion. And still to this day, those who kind of identify as being Jewish, they're not always on the same page. Like within kind of Judea, you had different like sects that kind of emerged, like groups like the Sadducees, who basically advocated for cooperation with Rome, or the Pharisees, who basically believed that they could isolate themselves from kind of Roman presence by basically just kind of focusing on religious like traditions and stuff like that. And then the one I went in more detail was the Zealots. These were people who directly tied Judaism with national identity. They believed in developing an independent kingdom away from this kind of Roman interference. The deal is that Romans tended to have a problem with these kind of Jewish like zealots, the communities here, because a lot of them kind of refused to recognize the Roman gods. Right? The Romans were relatively liberal in the sense they would allow for a lot of these cultures to maintain some aspects of their kind of like traditional religions, as long as they made an effort to recognize the Roman gods by building a Roman temple to Mars or Jupiter, or at least recognizing Roman feast days and things of that nature. All right. So another kind of group that kind of emerges out of Judaism, that's initially a sect of Judaism that has that same kind of belief of like kind of not recognizing the Roman gods, is the religion of Christianity, which here is your standard kind of textbook definition of what Christianity is. All right, the religion founded by and based on the teachings of Jesus. All right, now Jesus is one of these kind of unlikely figures. We take it for granted, right? But at the time, it's one of these unlikely figures that's going to create this revolution. There's a lot of similarities with Jesus and, let's say, Siddhartha Gautama, aka the Buddha, right? And in a sense, a lot of early kind of Christian kind of theology and stuff, and still to this day, has its origins in Judaism. For Jesus was Jewish, right? But it's the same thing with the Buddha, right? In Buddhism, there's certain tenets that kind of have their traditions in Hinduism, right? Like reincarnation and karma and dharma and stuff like that, all right? Both of them went around kind of preaching sermons and such, right? So there's some similarities. The Buddha was Hindu, right? Most of our early sources about the life of Jesus come from what they call the Gospels, right? This is where we see that shift from the Old Testament, which is primarily the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the Talmud, which have that kind of the tradition of Judaism. The New Testament, the beginning of the New Testament, are the 4 Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right, and we'll explain why those books were kind of chosen a little bit like tomorrow when I talk about the Christianity becoming the official religion of the empire, if you will. Now, the word Gospels comes from the Greek word meaning good news. Right? And so a lot of early Greek terminology, Greek iconic imagery comes from the Greek Christian imagery in terms comes from the Greek tradition. Right? This is mainly because this is the eastern half of the Roman Empire. The language that's primarily spoken in it was Greek rather than Latin. So you see the kind of Greek kind of coming in that service. Now the Gospels, these are written by those who were kind of associated with Jesus. Jesus does not write the Gospels. Yeah.
So I got a question.
Yeah.
If this is that, then how come it says 600 BC to 580?
Because that's the beginning of the chapter. 600 BC is like right around.
That's just the beginning of the
chapter.
chapter.
Yeah, it's the chapter. Yeah, I like kind of label those like so. Like when I get as I continue to teach this, I have to remember things.
Right.
Yeah. So when my pending Alzheimer's, like, what chapter is it? What's it dealing with? So that's mainly just for. It's a little cumbersome in like typing, but it's for my pending Alzheimer's. Right. And so, but initially in Christianity could be classified as a sect of Judaism. And there was other sects that had emerged as well that Christianity initially wasn't anything necessarily kind of groundbreaking per se. All right. There's a lot of tenets that comes out of Judaism, the concept of monotheism, right, and the importance of a text and such. Also, too, this concept of a Messiah. All right. Within Judaism, there is this kind of tradition of kind of with like hoping for a Messiah to emerge. All right. So Messiah is just basically a term meaning savior by God, right? And so within the Jewish tradition, a Messiah was somebody like Simon Bar Kokhba, that dude I talked about the last notes yesterday, the guy who led the revolt against Rome during the time of the Emperor Hadrian. Somebody like King David, although Jesus lays lineage to King David, he's not like King David in the sense of the Jewish interpretation of Messiah, somebody who's a religious but also a military and political leader as well. All right, and so Jesus doesn't fit that military aspect, right? He's like the meek shall inherit the earth, turn the other cheek, that type of stuff. All right, so that's why a number of like Jewish zealots groups like that were opposed to Jesus. All right, and unfortunately, as we get into like the Middle Ages in Europe, a lot of that becomes a justification for anti-Semitism and such. All right, and then the Roman, kind of like Pontius Pilate, the Roman military government there, viewed Jesus, although a small contingent of followers there, as a threat because they didn't recognize the Roman God. Now, the word Christ, Jesus Christ, comes from the Greek term Christos, which is Greek for Messiah. All right. So it's again, initially this is a kind of a sect of Judaism. It's mainly open to those who are Jewish. However, what emerges here is an individual who was an early persecutor of Christians. A Jewish individual was an early persecutor of Christians that later converts to Christianity that opens that up, so allows it to become a religion. So I'm going to play this short little video here. It's from a series called Mankind, the Story of All of Us, which is an attempt to basically catalog world history. There's some pretty graphics in there. Is John, you may recognize the voice. He's the actor who played Thanos in the Avengers movies, so you may kind of like recognize him. And he's talking about a guy we know as Saul of Taurus, but
Damascus, Syria. 4 years after the crucifixion, a man is on the run. Paul, preacher, troublemaker, and the most important convert in the story of Christianity. Before his conversion on the road to Damascus, he persecuted Christians. But now, he will turn an insignificant sect into a world religion. Today, he is known as Saint Paul.
He was a passionate guy. He was a guy with grit. He really believed in his God. He really believed in his gospel. Really believed that Christ was the only way.
For spreading the message that Christ is the Messiah, Paul is a wanted man. To Jewish leaders, he's a heretic. To the Romans, a rabble-rouser. If caught, he'll be executed. Damascus is a walled city. Every gate is heavily guarded. Paul's a escape route over the walls.
That's music.
For 20 years, Paul travels the Roman Empire, contacting other believers, spreading a message of hope.
He's telling people Christianity creates a salvation for anyone. If you have a slave who's being abused by his master, who has a horrible life, in the next life, his master will get what he deserves. And a slave, if he's a good man who accepts Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, will get what he deserves.
Paul writes letters to fellow Christians around the empire. Romans, Thessalonians, and Corinthians. They make up nearly half of the New Testament.
There is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, for all of you are one in Jesus Christ. We who are many are one body in Christ. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude.
Those letters become very much like the Twitter tweets that we see during the Arab Spring. This was the communication of the time, and it was very much under the Roman radar.
When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned as a child.
Paul's letters are entrusted to other believers who deliver them across the empire.
When I became a man, I put away childish things.
By this time, Rome has built 250,000 miles of roads, enough to circle the earth 10 times. Shipping lanes connect 250 major ports. This is how Paul spreads the word. Damascus.
So, the guy who's kind of credited to opening up this kind of Jewish sect to make it a religion, it's known initially as Saul of Tarsus. All right, but in kind of the Western tradition, we refer to him as Paul. All right, he's the Paul and SS Peter and Paul there. All right, and so like they were saying, Paul was a notorious persecutor of Christians. The story was he was heading to Damascus. Tarsus is in Syria, so he's heading to Damascus with the intention of persecuting more Christians. And the story was that on his way, he was knocked off his horse by a light, blinded by that light, and the light, then he heard a voice saying, Paul, why must you persecute me? He was brought back to health, and then he converted to Christianity, became a believer. And so what he does is basically kind of like opens it to what they refer to as Gentiles, kind of in the Greek world, non-Jews. All right. And so this basically transmits us from a kind of a Jewish sect to an actual religion by allowing it to be more inclusive for people. All right. He's often, like I said, referred to as the apostle of the Gentiles, although he was not the first. He wasn't an apostle in the sense that he knew Jesus. All right. So this is kind of like a painting here. We know Paul. All right. This is a famous painting by the Renaissance artist Caravaggio called "The Road to Damascus," which shows the moment after Paul is knocked off his horse. The guy kind of standing over them, kind of helping him out, is Saint Aeneas, who apparently took him in, basically nursed him back to health. The house in which Aeneas nursed Paul back to health later becomes a church just outside of Damascus. And the thing about it is that Paul was able to, after converting, he would travel around the eastern half of the Roman Empire. The thing that allowed him to do that, he was a Roman citizen. So that gave him one of the perks of being a citizen was him being able to kind of travel around. Now, eventually, he's kind of a wanted man. And he goes to all these kind of, and the Christian communities here are underground. To be Christian, you could basically be arrested and you basically would be tried and your punishment would be death. So he's going around a lot of places around in the Greek world. There's like half the New Testament is basically these letters to various kind of Christian communities, like the Ephesians, the Corinthians. Have you ever gone to a wedding Christian way, whatever, in church. Probably chances are you've heard one of the letters of Paul to the Corinthians, where love is never boastful, all that other stuff. You've never heard that before. And so this allows him to kind of travel around initially, but eventually he's kind of a wanted man. Now, for kind of Christians to kind of identify when they would go to places where other Christians were located, like I said, this is all underground. A lot of times they would look for these kind of secret symbols. And one of the first ones was it kind of looks like a wheel here, this image here. But embedded in here is essentially in the kind of the first letters in Greek, where like this supposed to be Jesus Christ, Messiah, Lord and Savior. All right. And so the first two, this is actually supposed to be like a P in Greek. The first two letters, the P and the X, represent what they call the chi rho. All right. Before the cross was the symbol that we know as Christianity, it was the chi rho that was there. All right. And so, like, if you were, this is in Ephesus in Turkey. So if you would see this embedded here would be like the P, the X, the omega, and all that. If you would see that, if you were a Christian, you would know that there was other Christians around, and that you'd seek refuge or whatever, right? And so the Romans had to kind of look for these symbols as well. This was kind of the time. So you had to be it was kind of a cat and mouse kind of thing here. All right. Don't need to type this down. But as a religion begins to spread, it kind of becomes popular with those who are essentially on the lower rung of the social ladder. There's about 8 million slaves in the Roman Empire at this time in the first century. So this becomes very popular with a lot of slaves, a lot of people who are poor. All right, it speaks to them that certain sense that the meek shall inherit the earth. There's a greater glory in heaven and stuff like that. All right, and again, Christians would kind of persecute the Christians were persecuted for not recognizing the Roman gods. There was a number of Roman emperors, but particularly Nero and Marcus Aurelius, were notorious for their persecutions. All right, and so what we start to see is like a lot of the earliest saints we would classify as martyrs. All right. And this isn't just strictly within Christianity. A martyr is anybody who dies for a belief. It could be a religious belief, a political belief, or whatever. But martyrs play a big role in basically adding converts to the religion. All right. As this kind of persecution kind of showed the weakness because many Christians were willingly going to their death. All right. Basically, for example, the Emperor Trajan, who's often referred to as kind of a noble pagan, was famous for not persecuting Christians. You have a question? Oh, I think you're saying. Would not overtly persecuting Christians. There was a letter that he had to a historian and one of his basically kind of government officials, a guy named Livy, who basically asked, "What do I do when Christians are discovered?" And he's basically, you ask them, "Are you a Christian?" If they deny it, then you let them go. Yeah, if they say, "Yes, I am," you give them another chance to basically kind of like wink, wink, are you a Christian? All right. And so when you would see them still have that, people like that, people were given an out, they were still basically accepting that they're Christian. So you find people that are kind of intrigued by this. All right. When you think about it, like for a lot of Romans, initially it was kind of odd that people are willing to die for a belief in a person who was essentially basically tried, convicted, and executed as a common criminal. Crucifixion was a common means of execution. All right, and so the more and more people are willing to die for their beliefs, more and more it kind of piques a lot of people's interest. So, beginning of the kind of like the 3rd century AD, about 200 or so, we got about 10%. It's really about 10% of the population are in the Roman Empire are Christians. And a lot of this was able to, because of the series of roads, you can see these ideas kind of changing and kind of spreading around. Certain, like I said, Nero was notoriously a persecutor of Christians. There was one legend in which Nero would have this ceremony dedicated to the Greek goddess Ceres. All right, and Ceres in this story was essentially, she was basically kind of like she was going to be sacrificed along with a bull. So a Christian woman would always be chosen to kind of represent Ceres and would be kind of sacrificed. When the Colosseum was built, famously, this is a painting called the Martyr's Prayer. Christians would be fed to the lions. Now, the numbers are debatable, right? But generally, what they would have in the games, particularly in Rome at the Colosseum, is in the morning you would have basically criminals fed to animals like lions and tigers and stuff like that. Then, like you would have like gladiator battles later. Christians were lumped in with general criminals, right? But there was a number of Christians that were kind of fed to the lions. This is a mosaic from kind of around a Colosseum in North Africa, which shows kind of a Christian being mauled there. In the Colosseum itself, there's a cross that's there to commemorate the Christians who died in the games. That is ironically in the same spot where the Emperor's box was. All right, like I was telling you, I showed you guys when I was talking about Trajan's column. Usually, when I traveled in the past, when I take a picture in front of things, I was always mean mugging. Mainly because I didn't want to get pickpocketed. And you maybe ask yourself, well, Mr. Randall, your physical presence alone should probably like kind of keep people at bay. Not always the case. So if you guys see me out, it's a little bit harder now with the mask. If you guys see me out and it looks like I'm mean mugging you, don't take it personal. It's just me, like I just don't want to get bum rushed. You know what I'm saying? So like don't think I'm like trying to like kind of front on you. All right, I really don't want no beef with nobody. All right. So eventually, even as the religion is underground, as we see more and more people convert to it, like with any organization, there has to be kind of development of structure, right? So in a lot of Christian communities, you would have the churches like, they basically, and a lot of masses were held in people's homes, basically. Some of the first churches were homes. You would have like in Antioch or in Smyrna, in Alexandria, you would all have these kind of Christian communities, and at the head of each Christian community would be chosen a bishop, all right? So at one point, it's significant, the Bishop of Rome, all right, as more and more people convert to Christianity within the city of Rome, was considered Peter. He's the Peter in the SS Peter and Paul, all right? Now, Peter and Paul both knew each other. Peter personally knew Jesus. He was the first kind of apostle, if you will. There was an incident where they actually kind of had an argument. They called the incident of Antioch, where they met in Antioch. And Paul kind of chastised Peter for not sitting with Gentiles. And Peter was a little kind of snobbish, I guess, in this argument, if you will, on allowing Gentiles to kind of basically kind of join the church, if you will. Paul lost the argument in the immediacy. He actually kind of left Antioch, he got pwned to a certain extent by Peter. But later in history, we know that by opening up this to non-Jews, it allowed it to flourish. Both of them are going to be martyred on the same day in AD 67 in Rome. Peter is going to be crucified upside down, as the legend goes, because he didn't want to be crucified like Jesus because of the incident where he denied Jesus 3 times. So he's going to be crucified upside down in the gardens of Nero. Yeah.
You know what's so funny about that?
What's that?
Like the whole thing about how it's bad if you turn the cross upside down.
Yeah, like in a lot of metal bands would do that.
Yeah, it's just ironic because
Yeah.
I never turn the cross upside down.
Yeah. I don't know where that started per se. And then Paul was afforded, because he was a Roman citizen, was afforded a quicker, painless death. He was beheaded, right, in Rome. And then he was buried outside of the walls of Rome. So this was both during the time of the Emperor Nero. That's why Nero usually has that reputation of being the Antichrist in many cases. But we start to see this kind of develop, this kind of structure develop, even while the religion was kind of underground. There's St. Peter. This is a Renaissance painting which shows Jesus in the foreground handing the keys to his church to Peter, the rock from which my church is built upon. And so if you ever notice the papacy, one of the kind of symbols of the papacy is the cross keys. That's related to that tradition. In the background, that building there in the background, that is the place where St. Peter is believed to be buried. That's the first version of St. Peter's Basilica, which was initially built by the Emperor Constantine, who I'll talk about tomorrow. This is what it looks like today.
So he's supposed to be buried there?
What's that? Yeah, they believe that he's buried at that spot there. Now the dome currently at St. Peter's Basilica was built during the Renaissance. The guy who designed the dome was the Ninja Turtle Renaissance artist Michelangelo. The Capitol building in D.C., the dome there is a replica of that. All right, that place where those guys went and threw a hissy fit last week. Later, this is going to play a story because at one point the church has got to raise money. This is during the kind of the 1500s. The church is raising money to kind of finish the construction of that dome. And one guy in Germany, this priest named Jan Tetzel, is selling these kind of certificates called indulgences. There's another dude named Martin Luther who is a little upset by those indulgences, and he basically voices his opinion by nailing his what they call 95 Theses on the wall, the church wall of Wittenberg. That begins the Reformation. So we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 12. This is the view from St. Peter's Basilica onto St. Peter's Square, which is namesake. I think I mentioned yesterday, there's actually, and smack dab in the middle is an Egyptian obelisk. There's actually more Egyptian obelisks in the city of Rome than there are in the entire country of Egypt. The Roman emperors a lot of times would bring those back, and they're still used today in Rome as kind of like geographical markers. That one was brought back by the Emperor Caligula, who we talked about. All right. So what occurs here, we start to see later, we'll talk about when the religion becomes essentially basically recognized and then later becomes the official religion of the empire. We see something established called the Petrine Doctrine. And there's all, this is to kind of like try to settle the debate as the religion becomes like out of the shadows. Who is the leader of the church? All right. And there's always this debate on what bishop was actually the leader of the kind of the Christian world. Right. The Petrine Doctrine, which was established during the Council of Nicaea, states that the Bishop of Rome outranks all the other bishops. Right. He is the father, the papas, if you will. That's where we get the term pope. Right. And so the pope's title is also, he takes the title of the Bishop of Rome. That's technically. So, and as a result, going back, they basically mark Peter as considered the first pope. Yeah.
How do they like do the whole pope selection nowadays?
Yeah, that's with the College of Cardinals. And so they'll have a what they call a conclave. So when a pope dies, the College of Cardinals go into the Sistine Chapel and they'll take a vote. They'll vote on that. And then when they come to, and it's just like any kind of political thing, you have factions and people kind of picking, like people are campaigning for that, like kind of behind the scenes and such. And then when they emanate, like they vote on paper, and then they tally the votes, and then they burn the little kind of ballots or whatever. And if it comes out of, like, people will wait, if it comes out of this kind of chimney there and it's white smoke, then they pick the pope. But it's all chosen by the College of Cardinals. So what's that?
What if it comes out as white smoke then?
Oh, then they haven't come to consensus, and then they have to kind of meet back again. So that's when so there has been times where it's taken days and something like that for.
So that's why the Pope always old, because they wait till he dead. They wait till the other one.
Well, we had currently the Pope Francis. He became Pope after Benedict XVI retired. Benedict was the first Pope to retire since what we call the Great Schism. We're talking the 1300s, I want to say 1400s. All right. Generally, they die. Yeah, usually popes die, and then that's when they kind of pick a new one. The first, probably, I think it's either 12 or 15. I'm not totally sure, so don't quote me. But at least the first, like quite a few first popes were all martyred because they were the kind of the head of bishops of Rome, like when it was in underground. Now, eventually, like I said, the religion is going to come out of the shadows and eventually become the official religion of the empire. Tomorrow,
now they're like the most protected person in.
What's that?
I said, now they're like, ain't the most protected person in
The
it?
Pope, yeah, pretty much. Got a kind of sweet Pope mobile. That's after John Paul II. In the 80s, there was an attempt on his life as he got shot. And so now they have that kind of like that plastic covering there. Yeah, that was after John Paul II's attempt on assassination.
So they always like, were they always allowed to roll through the area like do they always have parades like that?
Yeah, a lot of times. And like when we talk about when we get into like kind of the Middle Ages and stuff like that, there's some popes that do some scandalous stuff. The Reformation is kind of a reaction to some of the scandalous stuff that popes do. In the modern era, yeah, you would have popes kind of in parade, so they would be kind of guarded to a certain extent, but that plastic covering wasn't until the early 80s. They referred to it as a popemobile. So tomorrow we'll talk about a guy named Constantine, who becomes emperor, and how his role in kind of making Christianity the official religion, or at least bringing it out of the shadows. Did you guys get that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. I'll see you guys on the Chromebook. I'll see you guys tomorrow then, most of you, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.
You too.
I feel like the Pope.
It's all right.